If you're a nobleman, for instance, riding on horseback, hunting with hounds would be a good form of exercise. And if you're a priest, obviously, as like a woman, you couldn't go jogging around the precinct. So what you would have to do is your exercise indoors. And there's a wonderful regimen that was written for the canons of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. They were advised to weight train in their cells and to have a rope where they could do exercises on the rope to keep themselves fit.
Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. Like me, you might have assumed that people in the Middle Ages didn't exercise for fun. But according to Professor Carole Rawcliffe of the University of East Anglia, that isn't actually true. Carole has studied medieval fitness guides and concluded that lots of people, especially those in religious institutions and the higher echelons of society, were in fact very interested in exercise. Carole explains why to David Musgrove.
Let's get straight into it. Did people in the Middle Ages do exercise?
Oh, they certainly did. And they didn't just do exercise because they had to do. They did it because they felt it would keep them fit.
And how do we know that?
We know that because we've got an enormous amount of written evidence about this. These documents focus on regimens of health. These are guides to keeping fit in the Middle Ages. And just as we have lots of articles and books about keeping fit today, so in later Middle Ages, these books began to circulate. Started out for the rich and famous and, well-to-do people in high status. And then they began to trickle downwards, being written in English or German or French or whatever in the vernacular. So there's no shortage of information about this at all.
And there was one specific one that you've looked at, which is called the Regimen Sanitatis. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is fascinating, and I think it will resonate with people today because what it does is it tells you how to stay healthy. And it focuses on what are called non-naturals. And these are agents outside the body that you can manipulate to improve your health. And they include diet, which is called the first instrument of medicine. You are what you eat. Environment, clean air, clean water. Well, that certainly resonates today, doesn't it? And exercise, sleep, expulsion, which is using diuretics or laxatives or baths to get rid of impurities in the body, and what's called accidents of the soul. These are interesting because this is your psychological state. In this period, you don't make much distinction between physical and mental, psychological health. So things like anxiety, stress, fear, all kinds of different worries have to be managed in order to keep you both physically and mentally fit.
So this all sounds very holistic in the way that we might describe it today.
It certainly is. And of course, the rationale behind it is very different from our own, because you're looking at a society where people don't have microscopes, they don't know about germ theory, they don't have any of the advantages that we have today. They have very different views about how the body works. But they still want to keep the body in balance. And the idea of doing this is by managing things called humours, because people believe that you're made up of these four entities, which are hot and dry, cold and dry, hot and wet, and cold and wet. And so you manage these and keep your body in a state of equilibrium. And the language they use to describe these humours, we still use today. We talk about people being sanguine, that's hot and wet, or choleric, which is hot and dry. So these ideas have passed down to us now. But the rationale is very, very different from us today. And I have to say that people didn't keep fit in order to have beautifully honed bodies. They kept fit in order to keep that balance, that nice balance going.
Okay. Well, let's just pause for a second, because I imagine that people listening to this podcast might be scratching their head a bit and thinking, surely people in the Middle Ages didn't need to do exercise because they were all labouring hard in the fields. They didn't have the labour-saving devices that we enjoy today. So I think people were just thinking that this can't be right. So explain how people can be wrong about this.
Well, people were working very, very hard indeed. They didn't have the labour-saving devices, as you say, we have now. But these guides, I have to tell you, are aimed rather more at people who've got a bit of time off. And they make a very clear distinction between, say, walking around as part of your job or, hoeing in a field, or the work you might do if you're a brewer or a baker, and the taking of exercise for health. Because one of the first things about this is that you have to be very careful with the time of day when you take the exercise and the time in your life cycle when you take the exercise. So it's honed really to fit in with your digestive process and what you eat. So it's to make digestion work better, it's to make sleep work better, and it's to improve your general holistic outlook. So you've got to follow the guide. So you can't just exercise whenever you might feel like it. You've got to follow the guide and do it at certain points between your meals, certain points of the day.
Okay. So can you give us a sense about the prescribed calendar then? When were the appropriate times to do exercise?
Well, the idea is that humoral matter is made out of food. So the oven of the stomach cooks this matter, then goes to the liver, it's turned into the humours, and then it goes to the outer parts of the body, the organs and the extremities. And it's at that point when you're supposed to exercise. So it's when your stomach's almost empty, certainly not when it's full, but not when it's completely empty. And that facilitates the process of digestion and gets rid of corrupt humours that might cause disease. Because, we're going back, as I said, a time before the microscope, before people understood about germ theory. But they do know that it's vital to keep well, because once you fall ill, there's not much you can do about it. And after the 1340s, there's also the risk of bubonic plague. And so people are very jittery about their health. So they take these guides quite seriously. And although it may seem to us, to predicate your exercise at times when you're eating, it made a lot of sense to them. And what we're trying to do, historians like me, is to look at the world through their eyes rather through our own.
So I remember when I was a boy, my mum always used to stop me from going swimming until my food had gone down. So she said I wasn't allowed to go in the swimming pool for 2 hours after I had my lunch. I remember it quite specifically, and I was quite angry about it. But that's a very medieval attitude, right?
It's a very medieval attitude. It certainly is. And the other interesting things about your exercise programs is that they're not just predicated on your digestive system, but also on things like your gender, your age, your rank, your status, the circumstances of your life, and where you happen to live. Are you in a hot climate or are you in a cold climate? And also on your humoral temperament. So, if like me, you're a bit choleric, then you need rather less exercise than somebody whose temperament is cold and wet. So all these different factors. And what interests me, partly because I'm myself getting older, are the sort of regimens that were drawn up for older people, which are really quite interesting. So there's a kind of regime for whatever stage of life, what type of life you're at. It's quite complex.
What sort of exercise regimes were advised for the elderly?
Well, clearly, there's a practical side of things. I mean, if you've got wonky knees or something like that, then the idea would be that you take a gentle exercise for the upper body. So you might do light weight training, you might row. The idea generally is to keep as many parts of the body exercised as possible, because the theory is that as you get older, your supply of heat, which the great physician Galen described as nature's instrument, dies out, and you get colder and colder, and gradually your supply of what's called radical moisture dies, and that's like oil in a lamp. That's what keeps you going. So the longer you can keep your body warm and keep everything moderate, the more likely you are to live longer and to live a healthier life. And just as today, people are really interested in extending their lives, and you can buy guides to it. They've got their eye on the market here.
So just to pause for a moment, how did people know where they were in the humoral scale? How did they know if they were cold and wet? Who told them?
Well, there are lots of ways of telling this. I mean, you can look at a person, for example, and see what their temperament might be. If they're very pallid, their complexion is quite puffy, then they're phlegmatic. If they're quite ruddy-faced and plump, they're sanguine. But there are all manner of diagnostic techniques that a physician would use, for example, testing someone's urine, that kind of thing. So it's done with a considerable degree of precision. And your temperament can change over your life. You get, as I say, you get drier as you get older. Your gender can affect your temperament. Where you live can affect your temperament. The English were always making snide jokes about Dutch people who were regarded as being phlegmatic because they lived in a watery and cool place. The English saw themselves as sanguine, which was the best temperament to be, so no surprises there.
No, of course not. And you mentioned that there was sort of a difference in the sort of exercises advised between men and women. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yes, I mean, there were regimes for women, and the idea is there, of course, you have to be decorous. You're not supposed to be running around outside, jogging. Sort of exercise a woman might take would be gentle gardening, gentle walking, that kind of thing that was appropriate. But there's certainly a good idea to exercise. This idea that women should stay shut away doesn't obtain. In nunneries, for example, the nuns, as well as monks being in monasteries, were advised to take gentle exercise, get out into the fresh air. And we've got evidence of some convents where a great deal of money was spent, a great deal of effort expended on actually building nice walkways and gardens where the nuns could stroll about. So that they're not shut away, they're not cloistered in an absolute sense at all. Now, men, on the other hand, their exercise is often predicated by rank. So that if you're a nobleman, for instance, riding on horseback, hunting with hounds would be a good form of exercise. And if you're a priest, obviously, as like a woman, you couldn't go jogging around the precinct. So what you would have to do is your exercise indoors. And there's a wonderful regimen that was written for the canons of St. Bartholomew's Hospital. They were advised to weight train in their cells and to have a rope where they could do exercises on the rope to keep themselves fit. And these ideas, interestingly, in a medieval, very religious world, tie in with this spiritual sense that you keep yourself fit to do the work of God. And your fitness is in some ways next to your godliness. If you go walking, for example, which is a very widely recommended exercise, that's supposed to bring you closer to the environment and closer to God. So there is a spiritual side of things as well.
So that's interesting. If you were sort of notably and obviously unfit, would people frown upon you? Would people look down on you as lacking the appropriate moral fibre?
Well, they certainly might. I mean, there's evidence in monastic chronicles of people making rather rude remarks about people who were over chubby. And that was partly because, of course, gluttony doesn't go with the clerical persona. But one of the things that really interests me about these guides is how far people actually followed them. Because we know, for example, that Edward IV, King of England in the 15th century, had a lot of regimina, but he did die very young of a stroke, and he was said to overindulge terribly in eating and drinking too much. So there's clearly often going to be something of a gap, as there is today. Lots of people have gym membership and they never turn up, do they? So I think it may have been like that in the Middle Ages. But on the other hand, you're living in this plague-ridden society. You are going to be very conscious of these things. And certainly, given by the popularity of these guides, it's certainly the case that a lot of people did follow them.
Okay, so how widely read do we think these guides were? Do we get any sense about people actually using them and following them?
Well, we get a great sense when print comes in, because we do know that printed regimina were really, hot off the press, that they sold really, really well. Rather as in lockdown, these Keep Fit guides were selling tremendously well then. I mean, people are buying them. And far more people can read than is often supposed. I mean, I think about probably in the 15th century, a quarter of the male population of England could read a bit at least. But then people would read aloud. And so these ideas circulate. You can read books to other people. And also, they are written often in verse, these regimina, so that they're easy to memorize and you can repeat them and learn them quite quickly. There's a monk called John Lydgate who lives at Bury St Edmunds in East Anglia, and he writes verse guides on not catching plague and on a good diet. And he writes them specifically so people can remember them and then other people can learn them. And they're written in English rather than Latin or French, which is by this stage the language that, of course, everybody in England is speaking. And also, interestingly, you often find when priests are giving sermons and the text of these sermons survive, they go back to talking about regimens of health. So the assumption would be that most people in the congregation would know at least the basics of these things.
This is getting stupidly anachronistic, but were there people who were kind of like health influencers, fitness influencers in the medieval period?
I wouldn't go so far as that, but there were certainly high-status physicians who wrote regimina, these guides for their royal or aristocratic patrons. And then numerous copies were made of them. And I think there's a sense that people have, oh, the king's doing this, the queen's doing this, the Archbishop of Canterbury's doing it, or whoever, and that this is the kind of thing that we should do. There's possibly a bit of status involved in this as well. But certainly these guides are very popular. And we know, for example, that little bits of them pop up in people's commonplace books, in recipe books, in accounts. People are copying them out, which would suggest that they're circulating quite widely in society.
Okay. Can you give us any more of a sense about the sorts of exercises that people are doing then? So you mentioned these monks pulling themselves up on ropes. I mean, should we imagine people doing push-ups and pull-ups? What sort of things were they doing?
No, I don't think so. And I'm not 100% convinced that all the canons at St. Bartholomew's actually did this kind of thing, but they were urged to do it. You would choose a regimen that suited your pocket, suited your temperament, suited your age. And interestingly, when you look at what I was talking about, accidents of the soul, the idea about gardens and gardening, for example, is very powerful in this period. And we're coming back to it now, aren't we, that people need green space for health. You enjoy nature. You go for a walk in the countryside. Walking around mountains or hillsides, going to the seaside, inhaling fresh air, all these are recommended and seem to have a beneficial effect, and also in making you less anxious. Hunting is seen by Galen, the great classical physician, as being better than medicine. And one of the reasons you take exercise is to avoid having bloodletting or purgation. It's seen as the first stop.
And what about running? That's obviously a very popular activity today. You see people jogging around all over the place. Were people in the Middle Ages actually running at any point?
Yeah, I think they would do. I haven't come across much advice about running in these regimina. Brisk walking is considered better. And the reason for this is, we're talking in a society where moderation is important. People aren't going for the burn, like they used to do with Jane Fonda. The idea is that you moderately exercise as many parts of the body as you can do. So you're not going to get hugely breathless. This is advised against in regimens. A lot of physicians say, you shouldn't exercise to the point where you're puffing. You just do it to get the digestive fluid moving to the outside of the body, to get the supply to the brain, to make sure that your body's stimulated but not overworked. So we're looking at a society that goes for this golden mean, for this state of equilibrium, rather than pushing yourself to any extreme.
Okay, well, that seems very sensible. Obviously, people today, they go to gyms a lot. They go to designated places where they pay to go and do exercise classes. I imagine that there is nothing like that at all in the Middle Ages.
No, there isn't. Although you do have places where young men could go to learn to fight, to go to fence. In the army, of course, they have military exercises, which is a rather different thing. But guides for health of armies, which appear in the Middle Ages, recommend daily exercises for fighting troops. So in that sense, they are exercising together. But you can't imagine some of the elite people for whom these are written actually going to a gymnasium. They're doing it with a small circle of friends. And it's quite interesting that there's a proliferation of guides for the gentry. When you get into the 16th century, a man called Sir Thomas Eliot wrote a very interesting guide called The Governor, which is about bringing up youngsters. And he writes a lot about exercise. And what he recommends are sports such as archery, which requires a lot of balance and involves the whole body. Even dancing, but he's very, very down on football, which he describes as being beastly and excessively violent, and only for the lower orders. So contact sports are not the sort of thing that perhaps a upper-class, high-status person would go in for.
Oh, well, that is very interesting, because that was what I was going to ask next about team sports. So football, as you said, that does have a long precedent. But, I mean, that's not how we would imagine football today. It was a very different sort of experience. Can you tell us anything at all about any of the team sports that people were engaged in?
Well, football has a very bad reputation because it's often associated with uprisings. When there was the Great Kett's Rebellion here in Norwich, which is in East Anglia, it was known as the camping time, and camping was football. And so some of these contact sports are extremely violent, and they're generally avoided by those of higher status, or at least they're told to avoid them. But on the other hand, sports such as tennis, as I said, archery, the more decorous sports are the ones that are recommended. And one of the regimens that was written for King of Portugal was actually go so far as to say that the king should avoid contact sports such as wrestling because he might lose, and that would be demeaning. And I suspect there's also at the back of people's minds this idea about Nero, the Emperor Nero, who went in for that kind of thing and wasn't considered to be a good role model for, for people who were rulers in the Middle Ages.
Surely it would be unwise to beat a king at wrestling.
It would. It would be unwise to beat Henry VIII, I must say.
Is there any evidence for people actually sort of training to be physically fitter or to be better at sports? The way you've described it, it's much more about just generally being healthy. Is there any evidence of people sort of following regiments to actually just be fitter and healthier physically?
Well, I'm sure people did this because the idea is generally that the fitter you are, the physically fitter you are, the less likely you may be to succumb to disease. I mean, it doesn't always work this way, of course, but that's the idea in the background. I mean, I haven't come across cases of people working to be fitter simply to have a body beautiful, but that would go against the whole theory of regimen. I'm sure many people did. I'm sure young men were intensely competitive about these things, but I'm looking at them from the medical point of view rather than the more physical, social one. But I bet they did. I'm sure there was a lot of one-upmanship here, when it came to lifting weights and that kind of thing, because it would be inevitable, wouldn't it?
Tell us a little bit about the peasantry. So you said that it's unlikely that they would have been following the same sort of regimens as the upper classes. Clearly, they were having to do lots more manual labour. Is there any evidence that people who were doing manual labour, working in the fields, were then also doing exercise specifically to follow these sorts of regimena that you talked about?
Well, they may have been playing football, but no, they certainly weren't following regimena. I mean, these guys presume that you have money and you have time. And I think they probably percolated as far as what we might today call the lower middle classes, but I don't think they go down any further. But having said that, people of what I suppose they would call lower status in those days, ordinary working people, did have a lively sense of what might make you ill. So although they may not have, got in for regimens and physical fitness, they knew very well that they didn't want to live in streets that were full of dirt and filth and miasmas, because it was well known that dirt spread plague, that this plague was spread in infected air, as people believed. And so you have plenty of evidence, particularly from towns, but also from some villages, where quite low status people want to see a healthier and a cleaner environment. So they do have an awareness of health, but they don't necessarily have the time or the money, to devote themselves to individual regimes.
I just want to go back to monks again for a second, because they're fascinating. I'm delighted by
Well,
I'm delighted by the idea that they were nourishing themselves physically as well as mentally and spiritually. So should we imagine that most monks were involved in some sort of exercise regime? Would that have been part of the job?
It would have been by the later Middle Ages, and certain orders, particularly the Augustinians, are very hot on this, as are the friars, because they're doing pastoral work, which demands physical fitness. If you're going out into communities, looking after the poor, preaching, walking around a lot, you've got to be fit. And we've left behind largely the society of mortifying the flesh and starving yourself and wearing, clothes that are covered with lice and fleas to mortify the flesh. And we're looking at a society where people see fitness as being in God's image, and that it's your duty to take care of yourself. And also there's a very, very keen awareness that the monastic round can be psychologically deadening. You're seeing the offices of the church every day. You're on this treadmill of observance, and that can make you mentally ill. And people are very much aware of this. And so they do introduce fitness, they introduce good diet, cleanliness into monasteries. And in some monastic houses, many monastic houses, the choir monks get a bit of period off where they can go into the country or the seaside, and they can have a break from what they have to do, and they can exercise. And at St. Albans, one of the abbots got very, very cross because the young monks were going out into the fields and jumping over people's hedges, and he told them to stop doing that.
You've talked a little bit about the Black Death in the 1340s, and did attitudes to exercise change during the period then, and was the Black Death and all the horrors that attended to that significant in changing people's attitudes to exercise?
Yes, they did, and they changed them in a particular way too, because the theory is, as I said, that plague is spread by corrupt air. And therefore, during plague time, you don't want to start opening your pores. You don't exercise so hard that you begin to sweat. On the other hand, you need exercise to keep that humoral matter flowing around the body. You don't want it to become coagulated, because that will make you more vulnerable. So plague guides are specific about taking gentle exercise. You need to take it regularly, but it needs to be more gentle.
One of the things that I think is interesting, and certainly I took from the article, is the fact that this idea that exercise was a feature of medieval society is overlooked. Not many historians have studied this. Why is that? Why have we not taken greater note of this, do you think?
Well, I think there is a general view, or there has been until quite recently, that there's this awful period between the classical world and the Renaissance, when society was really rather dark and people didn't do much about their health. And medical historians now are beginning to reverse this. But certainly when it came to exercise, people assumed that nothing was really done until the Renaissance, and it was just ignored. But recently, more and more people have begun looking again at these factors and beginning to see that there's a lot written about keeping fit and healthy. So the subject is becoming one of interest again.
So what does that tell us more generally about the nature of medieval society then, do you think?
Well, I think it tells us that people have a much more sophisticated view of health than we think. They're much more anxious to take proactive measures to keep themselves fit. They're not fatalistic. I mean, there was a belief at some time that people just let rubbish heap up in the streets. People were washed with squalor, that they just raised their hands and accepted fate. And we know this now not to be true. We know that urban communities, for example, work very, very hard to keep their communities healthy. I think we've got a much clearer idea now of a society that takes real steps to preserve people's health and to take care of itself, has a rational approach to health. It may not be rational to us. We don't believe in humoral theory, but it made sense at the time. And people were anxious to make the best they could out of their circumstances, to learn about their bodies and to do their utmost to keep themselves fit and healthy for as long as possible, which is what we want to do today, isn't it?
Exactly. Right, Carole, this has been a fascinating conversation. Are you able to give us a view on whether medieval people were fitter than we are today?
Well, the interesting thing is you can give some idea of this from looking at the skeletal evidence. And skeletal evidence shows us that some people were very ill indeed, that they had very bad teeth, dental problems, and that often they died comparatively young. On the other hand, we do have evidence that members of elite classes in society may actually have been quite fit and healthy, and they certainly may have been well muscled. We've got evidence, for example, from Dublin that shows that a number of high status people would have been taller and generally fitter than those of lower orders. We find that across the country. So there is a sense, perhaps, that richer people may well have been rather fitter than we may have thought. Also, perhaps, soldiers, who were taking regular exercise. So there is a little evidence to show this, that exercise may have paid off in some cases. But we are looking at a society which, after all, has no antibiotics, no antisepsis, no blood transfusion, none of the technology that we just now take for granted. So obviously people are going to get ill and they're going to die younger.
Okay. And finally, if you were in possession of a time machine and you were able to get a medieval friar from Norwich and bring him to 2024, what would that friar think of the sort of exercises that we do? What would he think of people going off running marathons or going to a gym class to sweat on a bicycle for an hour?
I think he might have been rather unimpressed. I think he might have thought that people had lost their sense of priority and they ought perhaps to be spending a little bit more of that time thinking about their immortal health. But perhaps if he was a young friar, he might have been very anxious to get on that exercise bike and have a go himself.